stuck here in a dream. I'm just stuck here in a dream.
Welcome to the Guns and Yoga podcast. My name is Wendy Hummell. Today, my guest is Katherine Boyle, and she is a true inspiration. She created Beyond the Uniform and also hosts a podcast with the same name. Her mission is simple: to support police officers and their families, but I believe her message and content is relevant to all first responder families and military families. At the time of my interview, I had been exploring ways in my full-time role as the health and wellness manager in expanding family programming and resources, so my conversation was personally very beneficial. I know you're going to find value whether you're a family member, a spouse, a child, a sibling, a parent, or a loved one of a first responder, or if you're a first responder yourself. Supporting families isn't an anomaly, trend, or a box to check in the realm of organizational wellness. I recently attended the International Association of Chiefs of Police Officer Safety and Wellness Symposium in Kentucky, and the topic of family wellness was prevalent and the subject of many of the workshops offered. On a national and even international level, agencies are recognizing the importance of including families in our agency wellness programs. Speaking from personal experience, this isn't always an easy task. How to communicate and engage family members can be a challenge. We have experimented with several things at our agency, and we're working towards building a family academy. We're still in the early stages, but one thing that has worked well so far is bringing family members in before recruits graduate, which I know many agencies already do. Having a panel for them to include spouses, children, and parents of our agency members has gone over really well. Our agency also offers family member access to our Cortico Wellness app, in-house therapy, and access to other family events. My conversation with Katherine reinforced for me the need to embrace and include all perspectives as we consider what the future of family wellness looks like. In our conversation, Katherine discusses her own father's 28-year career with the Philadelphia Police Department and how he spent a significant amount of time as the lieutenant in the Special Victims Unit. Katherine's uncle and cousins are also police officers, and one of her cousins was killed in the line of duty. But she describes her upbringing as normal, loving, and healthy, something not typically heard in the world of first responders. Katherine discussed the inspiration behind her creating her business, the riots of 2020. She was living in New York at the time and was deeply impacted. She saw her own father and family members in those working the front lines and felt for them working those long hours and having to take on that emotional toll of the riots when they went home. She wondered what life was like for them and speaks to going home at night crying, even losing friends over her stance in support of these men and women. Katherine was called to action but wasn't sure what that looked like. She started by interviewing active and retired law enforcement officers. The answers she got were not what she expected. Many bared their soul, became emotional, and told her what they couldn't believe that she had such a positive experience growing up as the LT's daughter because of the close-knit, wonderful, even normal relationship she had with her dad and her family. Many of them said that they didn't get to know their kids until after retirement, and sadly, many are still estranged. Katherine was surprised because she'd always viewed her parents as role models when it comes to how she wants to raise her own family someday. Something you don't typically hear, especially in our line of work. But it doesn't have to be that way. She discusses how her parents were very intentional in how they raised her family and what that looked like. She shares stories such as recalling at a young age noticing that her dad's shirt said sex crimes and not understanding why he had that word on his shirt. She also recalls when she was in middle school and her dad started to share more details about his work. In particular, a case that he had worked involving reuniting a mom and a daughter who had been kidnapped as a baby. Her memories of her dad were sweet. She talked about when her dad would come home from work and how her and her brothers and sisters would punch him in the stomach for a few minutes. He'd go upstairs, change his clothes, and then come back down to play with him. Katherine said that she never really noticed anything unusual about her father's behavior, although she acknowledges he must have compartmentalized. He was able to find solace, she believes, in his drive home and working in the family pool. Research does tell us that almost 95% of what drives our behavior is in our subconscious. And Catherine said that she's not even sure if her dad was aware that his actions were helping him cope or not, but she definitely noticed. Catherine gives us her take on overtime, bringing your kids to work, and the role agency leaders must take in organizational and family wellness. I encourage you to check out her podcast, events, and website. Catherine has also just launched her own private community, and I will make sure all of the links are in the show notes. Enjoy the show. Please give us a like, review, and share with someone who you think may find value with this episode. Welcome to the show, Catherine. I'm so glad to have you.
I'm so glad to finally meet with you and be here.
Yes, we had a couple of snafus, didn't we? All on my part, but I appreciate your
there was
patience.
one on mine.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, that just kind of goes with the territory, I guess, right? Things come up, but I appreciate you being here. And for the listeners that aren't familiar with you, I would love it if you could just tell everybody who you are. Your name's Katherine Boyle. You go sometimes by the LT's daughter, which is how I first knew you. And you also have a business called Beyond the Uniform, which you founded not that long ago. If you wouldn't mind just kind of telling everyone a little bit about your background and really how all of that came to be.
Yeah. So my name's Catherine, also known as the LT's daughter. And I come from a long line of police officers. So almost all of the men in my family were police officers, including my dad. And during the riots of 2020, so just kind of getting into how I sort of came up with this idea, I was really impacted by them more than I think I probably would have even had anticipated. But I was living in New York City at the time. I lost friends to the whole ordeal, or people who I thought were my friends. And I would be on, Instagram, social media, seeing what was happening out there, seeing how they were treating these people who were working 18, 24-hour shifts. And I couldn't get it out of my head. Like, I was crying at night. I couldn't sleep at night because all I could see was fathers like mine, uncles, brothers, cousins, sisters. Like, I could literally only see the family member, and I couldn't understand how they were expected to go home at night and just hang out with their family or just be by themselves. And I just said to myself, I have to do something to support these people. And I always knew, you can support them by donating to the various nonprofits, and that's wonderful. But I wanted to do something that was more like boots on the ground, where they knew that I was a civilian who wanted to be there for them in some capacity. So I started interviewing active and retired police officers, essentially, and just kind of asking them, like, if a civilian was to support you, what could that look like? And during these conversations, all that they kept bringing up to me was, I can't believe the childhood that you had. I would tell them about myself. I would tell them about why I wanted to do this. And they would say straight up to me, some of them cried. They would be like, I can't believe that, I'm talking to you right now. And if my kids were to talk about me, they wouldn't be saying anything like what you're saying. They were saying, it took me till I retired to get to know my kids. I got to retirement and I realized I didn't know my kids, or just these different concepts that it never even crossed my mind that this was a thing, let alone so common, because I didn't talk to a single one during that time, a single police officer, active or retired, during that time who, related to my situation, to having a wonderful relationship, a really close relationship, growing up, you know, very normalized in the household, didn't really even understand what my dad did, which we can get into. Um, and so having those conversations and having that constantly coming up for these people, I kind of thought, all right, maybe this is it. This is where we're lacking. We need to really reel it in and focus on the family life, because they're struggling at home and the awareness isn't necessarily there, and something needs to happen. So that's kind of how it came to be.
So, and that's really that's kind of amazing, like just to kind of step back and hear what you're saying, because if I'm understanding you right, obviously your dad was a police officer. I think he's retired now for how long? I don't remember if you
Yes,
said.
he's retired now. He was a police officer for 28 years and he worked as a lieutenant in Special Victims Unit for Philadelphia.
Okay, so for 28 years, and at the time when the riots were happening, was he still active or was he retired at that point?
No, he was retired at that point. He's been retired for about 12 years.
Okay, I'm sorry. I know you said that.
No, it's okay.
So in an effort to really you go in talking to them asking one thing, and I don't know, it sounds like you were kind of surprised and taken back, and it was an unexpected response that you got,
Yeah,
which is so great that your business and now kind of your mission was born out of identifying a need and a gap.
yeah.
And even though it wasn't necessarily what you intended, I think it's great that you responded in the way that you did. So tell us more.
Yeah. So I went into it thinking like, okay, you know, mental health is a big thing, especially, in 2020, mental health across the board was a big thing. Um, Dealing with traumas, healthy coping mechanisms. I'm also a fitness coach. So I was like, maybe there's a fitness element here. And so these are the things that were kind of running through my mind. And I just like took a hard left turn, I guess, because it never felt right. It never like settled. There's people out there who have these resources for first responders. And again, that's amazing. I'm very glad that they're there, but it never felt right for me because again, I want to be boots on the ground supporting them, but I've never been a cop. So I can't tell you how to train to, catch the guy that you're chasing or what have you. So it never felt in line. And once I started talking to these people and this is what kept coming up, I was like, well, my whole life, I'll tell you this, my whole life, I have always said, like since I was a child, if I ever have kids, I want to raise them the way my parents raised us. I want to
Mhm.
do things the way my parents did it. They waited till they were in their 30s to get married. They waited till they were in their mid to late 30s to have kids. They did everything, they had their life and then they had the life where they were there for their family and that was their priority. And I always admired them for that and really looked up to them for that. And so I always said, like, if I'm blessed enough to have kids in the future someday, like, that's the way I want to do it. And that was just a completely separate thought process that I had. And then, come in these police officers telling me that this is especially unique in the police space. I'm like, all right, this is the path that I'm supposed to be taking.
Yeah, no, and really hearing you say this, it is really definitely something that you don't typically hear when we have this
Mhm.
conversation. In fact, quite the opposite. But if you don't mind for just a minute, let's take a step back and
Mhm.
just if you don't mind getting into your childhood a little bit, how you grew up, if you had siblings, and kind of what that looked like. You mentioned a little bit about what your dad did. But I know that maybe we all know that cops don't work, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. So, in the grand scheme of his schedule and kind of how that worked, and you still not being impacted or even really noticing that there was any kind of issue with his job.
Yeah. So I grew up in Philadelphia. I have an older sister and a younger brother, and we're all very, very different, but we're all very close. We still go home for the holidays, home for the birthdays, like all the things. I was actually interviewed on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and they compared my upbringing to Beaver Cleaver, and I was like, well, I cannot argue because it's silly, but it's kind of true. Um, and yeah, so my dad did have a bit of a wonky schedule, is how I kind of refer to it. But, and I touched on this earlier, it was always really normalized for us. So if there were, spurts of time where he was, working during the day and we couldn't sleep, we sat down to dinner every night as a family. And there was times when he would be missing from the dinner table. And it was just, again, very normalized, like, okay, for the next couple weeks, the next couple months, dad is on this schedule, so he's going to miss dinner, but he's going to wake you up for school in the morning instead, or he's going to read you your bedtime stories instead. Whatever it was just very like, we're not going to make a big deal out of it. It's just kind of the way it is right now, and it's going to go back to normal sometime. And again, if his schedule was so that he was getting home early in the morning, he would be the one to wake us up in the morning, and then he would go to bed. If he got home later in the evening, he would be the one to read us our bedtime stories. And sometimes he would fall asleep in the bed with us. And like, he always sort of found ways to make it so that he would see us, even if it wasn't quote normal times of the day, or expected times of the day. But then also he sort of, one, he was very strong in not taking on overtime almost ever. And I know that's something you talk about. He very, very rarely took on overtime. And two, he also went after promotions that would give him the lifestyle that he wanted. So he was a lieutenant because he wanted to be a lieutenant, but also because it kind of gave him a little bit more of a typical schedule for the most part, so that he could sort of balance that home and work lifestyle, which is what he wanted to prioritize us.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. I'm assuming, hearing you talk about all this, because, and as a parent myself with a first responder husband, you have to be really intentional in the way that you decide to raise your kids, given those crazy schedules, or wonky, the word you used. So I'm assuming you talked to your parents about, like, what was the process here? How did you guys decide that you were going to do this? Because it sounded like they did such a phenomenal job.
Yeah, and intentionality is like a big piece of it. That is exactly what they were. And one, I think part of it is that, again, the age thing, the maturity part. My dad didn't become a cop until he was 30, and he became a cop because he needed a job. He didn't become a cop because, you know, he wanted to be a hero. And again, everybody has their own reasons, and that's honorable and noble also. But for him, it was like, I need to support the family that I want to create within the next couple of years. So I'm going to get a job that pays the bills. His brothers, his older brothers, were cops. They had great health insurance, and so it sounded like a good job to him. And so when he did that, he and my mom made the decisions, like, this is kind of the way we're going to do it. My mom actually did kind of give it to him. She was like, I'm not going to tell you how to run your career, how to do your career. So he mostly made that decision himself. And then with the overtime piece, they made the decision that my mom wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, and he didn't want to take on overtime. So they were very strict with the budget. And again, that intentionality piece, I remember my mom sitting down at the kitchen table every week, like doing the books, making sure everything was in line. And again, they were just very intentional, and there was a lot of forethought in everything that they did in their lives once they made the decision to have kids.
Yeah, and it sounds like, I think you know who maybe your first two podcast guests are when you start doing your podcast again.
Yeah. Yes. Sign you up.
Yeah, because it sounds like they really have a lot to offer, when it comes to talking about these things. Because like you mentioned, when we first started out the conversation, when in talking to these officers, that is not the norm. That is not typically what you hear. Now, it's not always the case. I think there's more people that are paying closer attention to these things, but like you said, it's always something that there's a lot of intention, and it's a priority for them, that they put their family first instead of their job, which isn't typically what you see.
Yeah, definitely. And my parents, I do try to pick their brains too, and they're so nonchalant about it all the time. It drives me crazy because I'm like, but what you did is not the everyday, and you know it. Like, again, my dad was a lieutenant, so he knows how the people who worked for him, he mentored them and helped them through it. So like, they're hard nuts to crack, I will say.
Well, it sounds like they're just really humble people.
I guess that's what it is. That's a nice way of putting it.
Well, I don't know them, so I could say that, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us just a little bit about what you knew growing up about your dad's career? You said you didn't know a lot, but you knew that he was a lieutenant and you knew what unit he worked in. But did you know, did he ever talk about work very much with you?
A little bit with us. So when we were really little, I definitely didn't kind of understand what he did. I remember this is kind of funny. I don't think I've actually ever talked about this. When he first got into the department, Philadelphia was called Sex Crimes Unit. And we got, I think, like a New York Police Department transfer, and he changed it to Special Victims Unit, the way it is in New York. Um, but I remember when I was like really little, my dad had a polo shirt that said Sex Crimes Unit on it. And I remember thinking, seeing him wear that shirt and thinking, why is my dad wearing a shirt that has a bad word on it?
I can only imagine.
And that's probably like my first memory of having any idea of what he did. But I knew that he had some accessories for work that he didn't necessarily let us have any access to. Um, and that's kind of it when I was really young. When we got a little bit older in like middle school, he started sharing stories with us. He dealt with children mostly, and that children and high risk adults. So, like old people who maybe have dementia or what have you. Um, but that included like missing persons and things of that nature. So when we were in like middle school, he had a really big case called the Delamar Vera case, where she had been abducted as a baby, and the birth mother found her as a little child and went to the police department to say, this is my baby, she was stolen from me. And that was his case, and he reunited them, and his team reunited them. So I think that was probably the first case. I was in like 7th and 8th grade for that one. That was the first case that I remember he really opened up to us about, and we got to kind of know some of the details, because it was traumatic, yes, but it wasn't some of the others that he dealt with. So
Yeah,
I would say
and
around 8th grade I kind of really understood what he did.
got it. And I'm curious, you're just making me think because I spent quite a bit of time working in sex crimes when I was a detective. And I'm curious from your perspective because I know that those things are hard to work. I know those cases are difficult to work, and it was difficult for me. Certain cases were a little bit more difficult than others. And so I'm curious if for some reason or if you noticed that things impacted him when he came home. Were you able to tell, or have you ever talked to him about how it impacted him?
Yeah, we were actually interviewed on a podcast called Between the Lines a couple months ago at this point. And so to answer your first question, and sometimes I hate to say this, but no, when I was a kid, I really didn't think that it seemed like he was impacted. Um, One thing that I remember super vividly when we were very small is he would come home at the end of the day. My siblings and I would greet him at the door. The first thing we would do is punch him in the stomach because he had like a beer belly. So we would punch him in the stomach. He would go upstairs, put on regular clothes, and then he would come down and play with us while my mom cooked dinner. And that's like one of my youngest family sweet little memories. Um, and when I've asked him about it, it's just he was good at compartmentalizing. And again, I think a big piece of it was his maturity going into it, where he really had the wherewithal to say, like, I have to make sure that I take care of myself and not get too wrapped up in this, or figure out ways that I can step back, or make sure when I get home I'm not focusing on other things or what have you. So what he said when I've asked him, and what he said on that podcast, was that he was really, really able to compartmentalize.
Yeah, and you hear that word a lot when we're talking about law enforcement and the things that we see. And I'm curious, like with your dad, do you know, or has he spoken to how he would unpack that? Because, we know that sometimes when we compartmentalize and we don't ever deal with whatever that thing might be that might be an extra hard case to work. That doesn't necessarily always serve us. But so my guess is there was something he did for himself, that he was able to deal with those things when they did become difficult.
So, one I would say is his drive home was about 45 minutes. And I
Hmm.
think that was, whether he realized it at the time or not, I think that that was probably a pretty big element because he had all of that driving time kind of to himself to decompress, to get the thoughts going, to sort of get past or get through anything that may have happened during the day. But the other thing is he took care of our family pool, and like that was big for him. Especially once we got a little bit older and we weren't like playing on the living room floor anymore. He would, after work, he would clean the pool, like vacuum, skim the whole ordeal, and then he would float on his floaty in the sun. And I think that that was really big for him, to just kind of have that him time and that relaxed time and to clear out his thoughts.
And I have no doubt you're right because I've heard from, well, my husband's one of them, but so many other first responders, cops in particular, going outside, moving your body, being in nature,
Yeah.
doing something physical and to get out of your head.
Mhm.
That in and of itself has been kind of a big game changer for a lot of people, and it's different for everyone. So I was just curious how he handled it, and it sounds like it was a really healthy way for him to manage the type of work he did.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, especially for him, and this is the 90s we're talking about, um, was what did I love to do before I became a cop, which was take care of pools. And what feels good. I work a stressful job. I see horrific things all day. What do I want to go home and enjoy doing? Not shut down, not drown out. What do I want to go home and have a good time doing? And that was, again, the pool, the being outside, the playing with us, the taking us to our events, things like that. I don't think that there was a whole lot of, I'm going to do some self care and float in the pool today in his mind. But again, it was just coming back to that, what feels good, what's going to make me happy today.
It was innate. It was natural. He didn't
Mhm.
think of it in that way. It was just
Yeah.
something that he did because he was taking care of himself.
Exactly.
So back to what you were saying when we first started out. So you were very bothered and impacted by the riots, and so you wanted to do something, and then you started to understand that your childhood was much different than what others experience. So what was the next step after that?
So after that, I threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. Like I had no idea where to even begin. But I was actually looking for local events where I could meet police officers in person and have those conversations, the ones that I was already having, but I wanted to have them in person just because, COVID's over. I want to do things in person. I want to get out there. I want to push myself. And I couldn't find any. And I was like, well, if there's no, events in this area for me to meet police officers, do they have any sort of outlets to meet other people who kind of understand what they're experiencing? And so from that, the concept of events was born. And so that's kind of the direction in which I took the whole thing, which later the pieces kind of fell into place because what came out of the events was, I want to be there for my families. I want to have or offer the life that you had. I want to do these things, but everybody around me makes fun of me, or everybody around me doesn't understand, or everyone
Gotcha.
around me wants to go out and have drinks afterwards, or whatever it is. Like, not everybody's values on the job were aligning, and some of these people were feeling isolated. So when the events came up, they felt um, validated or welcomed by this concept that there were other police officers who had these same values and wanted to prioritize these things. Um, and so that's become like a big piece of it for me, is being able to bring these people together. he or she might not be in your department or working on your shift, but they're out there. And if you come to one of my events, online or in person, you'll meet them and you can connect with them, and you'll see that you're not alone, and you'll have them for any support if you need it.
Right. And it sounds a lot like the concept of peer support, which I talk a lot about, because I think in a different way, that's what you're referring to, because
Mhm.
not everybody has the same, like you said, values and outlook. And so to be in you, but you want to fit in when you work in a
Mhm.
particular culture or on a certain shift. And we can talk about culture. That's probably a whole separate podcast
Oh, yeah.
episode. But so it sounds like what you've created is a group for people to come together that are like-minded, whether they work together or not.
Mhm. Yeah. Whether they work in the same department or not, they have some sort of understanding of what the other person is going through, what they've seen. And same thing with the spouses, right? I also host events either catered towards the spouse or for the couple themselves. And again, it brings the spouses together. Um, and that was, again, not to go back to my parents, but that was a big thing for my parents too. My dad had a really strong identity outside of the job,
Mhm.
beyond the uniform, if you will. And he maintained almost all of his childhood friendships. I mean, I had a whole table of his childhood friends at my wedding. And his cop friends, we'll call them, he had many of them too, but he and my mom were friends with them together, and they would go out together. And it was like he almost compartmentalized his friendships, where it was like, okay, we're going to go out with so and so and their wife today. And that's what this vibe is going to be, versus I'm still going to stay grounded and be friends with all of these other guys who do all of these other random jobs. Um, so that's another element to it, I guess, is just sort of bringing all of those people together to support each other.
Yeah, and like you said, it really just comes down to it's really impressive how intentional he really was, and your mom, and the way that they wanted to live their life. And again, the priority was obviously your family.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And yeah, he could definitely write a book himself about his process. But that I can see by your look, people can't see what I can see because it's audio only. But you probably already told him that.
I wish he would. I wish he would.
Yeah, great. So moving forward, you do these events and you
Mhm.
bring people together. So you've created a community.
Yes. I'm actually, funny you mentioned that, in March of 2024, I will actually be launching a community. I really want to have a place for these people to connect, without me. Um, and I feel strongly that I don't want it on Facebook.
Mhm.
So I am working to find an app situation that will allow me to sort of create a safe community space that will protect the privacy of these people. So that's going to be coming in March of 2024. But in addition to that, yeah, I host events. I try to host them every month, if not every 6 weeks, either in person here in the Philadelphia area or online. So just a couple weeks ago, I had one in this past March, for holidays. So I did like a holiday traditions workshop, which was really fun. It was, again, it was online. And that was a really fun time to sort of connect over the uniqueness of the job, but also like the specialness of the job and the special traditions that I had growing up, and the special traditions that some of the other ladies on the call, that was actually all spouses, not on purpose, but it was all spouses. Um, and so that was a fun one. And then coming up, in the new year, I will be doing more events. So I'm very excited for what's to come next year.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. And if you don't mind, I'm just curious for the listeners, can you just get it a little bit? We don't want you to tell us too much, but little bits, a couple of things that you think are really key takeaways from that last workshop about the holidays. Because you're right. I mean, that's the one thing that we all know with shift work. We've got to work 24/7, so it's inevitable. Even if it's just in the beginning of your career, this is something you're going to experience.
Yeah, I would say the biggest takeaway across the board actually is that what the holidays look like to the outsiders doesn't matter. So
Mhm.
literally whatever happens in your four walls only matters to the people in those four walls. So if you're celebrating Christmas on December 20th, nobody cares, and if they do, it doesn't matter, because all that matters is how you're interacting with the people in your family and your household. And beyond that, if you or your spouse can't make it to a holiday because of work, if anyone is not understanding that or giving you a hard time about that, boundaries are really important, and just sort of having a strong backbone to say what needs to be said. And I mean, not starting a fight or starting an argument, but if someone is not willing to understand what you or your spouse does for a living, then they need to be educated.
Do you mind, and that's such great advice, Catherine. Do you mind sharing? Is there a tradition that maybe you had growing up with your family that you wouldn't mind telling everyone about?
Yeah. So decorating the tree was its own sort of holiday for us. It could fall on any day of the year, or any day of the month, so it didn't matter what my dad's work schedule was. And we would have a big dinner, a big takeout dinner. We would decorate the tree, and then we would watch a Christmas Carol, either Muppets or Magoo, and then we would put up our stockings and go to bed. And so that was kind of like a special holiday tradition for us. And for us, it was like, we're even more special because we get extra celebrations. You know what I mean? It was like, we also have Christmas and Christmas Eve, and maybe dad will be there, but like, we have all of these days to celebrate. So that was kind of fun for us, I think.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And I really like the way you frame that. It's just it's all about what matters to you and your family, and it really doesn't matter what happens, what other people think externally.
Yeah. And we still do that tradition every single year. I mean, I lived in New York City for 12 years, and every year I came home for that.
Oh
And
wow.
it became my schedule that we worked it around, because again, it could be any day of the season. So every time,
Yeah.
every year.
So now that you're all older, obviously, and your dad's been retired, what does that look like? Are your holidays quote unquote normal? Do you have them on, the actual day?
Yeah, now they are quite normal. My dad's retired, but he does work full time. He opened a sexual assault response center
Oh, okay.
outside of special victims unit, so the victims have like a safe place to go and get their exams. So he runs that full time, but it is Monday to Friday.
Hmm.
And yeah, now we celebrate pretty typically Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. We still do our tree celebration, and for me, every year, New Year's Eve has always been really big for me personally. And every year, I spend New Year's Eve with my parents, and we watch the Twilight Zone marathon.
Oh wow. Okay. I haven't heard the Twilight Zone is something I watched growing up, but haven't really I think it's been at least 20 years since I've seen an episode.
Oh yeah, every year for as long as I can remember.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned that you have these events that you're probably going to do, regularly, and that you're going to create a community. We talked a little bit before we actually started recording that you have a podcast, kind of got paused for a little bit, but that you're gonna kick it back up again in the beginning of the year. Can you give us a little bit of information on that? What kind of guests you're going to have, and how often you're going to put episodes out?
Yeah, so I'm going to be changing the name. It's going to be Going Beyond the Uniform with the LT's Daughter. And it's going to be once a week on Tuesdays to start. I'll be doing one sort of solo episode where I talk about something that I feel strongly about, something that's, on my heart, on my mind, something that I want to get off my chest, or maybe a story that I want to share that I think might help others. And then the next week will be a guest interview with either an active or retired officer of law enforcement. Eventually, I will bring in other children, but to start, it's going to be active or retired law enforcement. So I'm going to kind of volley off that way. And again, on Tuesdays each week.
Great. I can't wait. I can't wait. I'm gonna be watching.
Oh, great. I'm excited.
Yeah, for sure. Or I'll watch or listen, depending on if you have video or audio.
Listen to start, watch
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. So we also talked about this before we recorded, but I want to pick your brain a little bit. So this is kind of twofold. I think this will be good for the listeners to hear, but it's also helpful for me because I told you, and most of the listeners know, I have a full-time post-retirement job as a health and wellness manager for a sheriff's office in the same town I retired from. And one thing that we've been committed to doing is really building out family resources. And in 2024, that's a big priority for us. And so I'm curious, there's a lot of spouses that I interact with and get input from, but not a whole lot of kids, of first responders. And so I think this is a really interesting perspective. And so I'm just curious, and I know that things were really good when you were growing up, but what would you recommend, let's say, to your dad's former agency, if they came to you and said, "Hey, we're gonna build a family wellness program. What do you think should be included?"
I think to start, we have to get leadership kind of in a supporting position where leadership understands that these people might have families. And even if it's just encouraging them to spend extra time with their families or to go home and hang out with their kids, I think that it always starts with the top down. So I think just sort of getting leadership. So maybe to be a little bit more specific to your situation, having people in leadership positions coming in and speaking about maybe their experiences or what they've learned, or even just what they think, would be huge, because I think that permission piece from leadership is huge. um, Also, don't overthink it. So especially if you have young kids, they don't care what you're doing. They don't care how involved the activity is. There were times my parents didn't know what to do with us, so we just went to the park and hung out, and they were some of the best times of our lives. They just want to be with you and to know that they're loved by you, as their parents. So I think that those two would be huge. And then I would say that identity piece is actually a pretty big element of it. Don't get lost in the job. Don't take on unnecessary overtime. I know I actually listened to your interview with Scott recently. Um, so that overtime trap is tough. So again, don't take yourself out of your own home more often than you need to be. Your job is already crazy, and it's only crazier in this world, and you're only working, you know, so much. Don't do it to yourself more. Don't take yourself away from the people who love you more than you need to be. Um, so I think that those would be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great input. And I'm curious too on your take on this. So, growing up, I don't know if your dad ever brought you into his your squad room or work, or if I know you didn't know a whole lot of details about what he did, which I understand why. Do you think that's helpful for families to have a little bit more of an understanding and less of a mystery about what mom or dad does when they go to work?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked that. So, one thing I do remember, and I used to talk about this a lot, I was not allowed to participate and take your daughter to work day as a kid. And I hated it because I would go to
Mm.
school and all the girls would be missing, but I would have to be there. And I was like, why? This isn't fair. So, to kind of make up for it, my dad would sort of figure out a Saturday where the holding cells would be empty, and he would take us in. So we could kind of go in and it would be slow and there wouldn't be like mass chaos, which is what he wanted to avoid by taking us in on whatever random day the city decided take your daughter to work day was. He could kind of control the situation, and it was cool because then we got to see what dad did. Kind of, for me, it was an office, but it was cool because the other police officers would fawn over us as the LT's little kids and things like that. So um I think it was cool. It gave me cool insight. I know one time my brother went and there was a guy in one of the holding cells and he thought that was really cool. And I think too, like, especially now that there's so much exposure to what goes on in society, how people feel about the police, what the police are dealing with. I think it's important to kind of have an understanding of what is going on, because it's not always chaos. It's not always dangerous. And I think having that communication piece where it's like, sometimes there are boring days at work. It's not always high speed chases and chaos and stuff like that. And I think just kind of having that understanding can bring sort of peace of mind to whether it's the kids or the spouse. Again, especially in this day and age, we didn't have all of this exposure when we were growing up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's really great feedback. And I love the ingenuity of your dad, because I get it. He doesn't want to bring you in when he can't control what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But he still found a way to make you understand what he did, and to make you a part of his work life.
Yeah. And it was that much more special too, because it was like, okay, fine, I can't go and take your daughter to work day, but my dad wants to take me to work on this random Saturday. How fun is that? And like we would
Sure.
plan for it, and it would be like, all right, this weekend we're going, and it was something to look forward to. So it was really special for us.
Yeah, for sure. And, as I hear you talk, and I know you have siblings, a lot of times, and you mentioned that your dad came from a family of cops, like his I can't remember what you said, but brother, you have uncles and other
Mhm.
family members. So did you or any of your siblings, did the idea ever come for you to be in law enforcement? Or maybe they are in law enforcement, I don't know.
They're not. So yeah, my dad and both of his older brothers
Mhm.
are cops, and then most of my male cousins are cops. Um, when I was like 2 or 3, I actually had a cousin who was killed in the line of duty, and
Hmm.
I think that was for my dad. That was like a point where he was like, "All right, not for my kids. They're not going to do it. I can't have them be in this field." And so growing up, it was actually quite discouraged. I do remember it being like, "Nah, I don't think this is the route for you." And um, when we got older, they didn't really have to worry about my sister and me. But when we got older, a little older, they found out my brother was colorblind, and they were like, "Whew, what a relief! He can't be a cop anyway."
That's funny, because even if, I've heard this too, where, because I've been in the same boat, I still do not. I'll let my daughters, obviously, I'm going to support whatever they want to do, but I prefer that they don't go into that line of work.
Mhm.
It doesn't appear that we're headed in that direction, but I've heard of other people say the same thing, and sometimes, they can, that doesn't necessarily work out. They get influenced by their parents, and they decide this is what I want to do. So even if you're, as a parent, you don't want your kid to be a cop, sometimes it still happens.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, anytime we've brought it up, because there was a minute there where I thought I wanted to be a cop, but everyone kind of laughed at me. But there was a minute, and he was kind of ho hum about it. It was like, we're not going to talk about this kind of a thing. But then at the same time, he would kind of be like, all right, throw my hands up in the air. Whatever you want to do, you're going to do, and I'll be here for it. But I would really appreciate it if you didn't do this.
But what's interesting is that your father's career impacted you and influenced you, and which is why what you're doing right now. I mean, it's obviously very, it's a passion of yours, and I can see just by looking at you that this is something that's really important to you, which probably, my guess is, would not have happened if you did not grow up surrounded by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always been sort of mesmerized, for lack of a better word, by cops. I've always known that, they're a safe place to go. I've always looked at them as hometown heroes, little neighborhood heroes, whatever you want to call it. I mean, my dad was like our neighborhood hero. Everyone knew, if there was a fight breaking out, you go to Mr. Boyle's house
Mhm.
because he's going to make it better. And so I just kind of grew up thinking that of all cops, more or less. There was like a period of time where I would be nervous around cops because, like, I don't know, the same way you'd be nervous around a celebrity, I feel like. And so I've always, had the utmost respect for them and really appreciated what they did. And 2020 wasn't the first time that I decided I wanted to support them. For years, I would be Googling, like, how can I support police? And again, I mentioned it earlier, like, nonprofits would come up and donate here would come up. And I'm like, no, that's not what I want to do. I want them to see me supporting them. Um, and through that, actually, in 2019, I went through the NYPD Citizens Police Academy, which was a lot of fun.
I bet.
Yeah, that was really fun. So yeah, I've always been, and I don't think I ever realized it until I started talking to those active and retired police officers. I don't think I ever realized how impacted I was by, what the men in my family did.
Yeah. And just moving forward, like I said, for what we're doing at work right now, building out this family program, I'll definitely have to stay in touch with you and kind
Mhm.
of bounce some ideas off of you because, like I
Please.
said, there's a lot of spouses that
Mhm.
want some input, but there recently. We've had some people come through because I have a lot of contact with our recruits that come through, whether they work in the jail or they work out on the street. And I have heard some comments about some things because I teach resilience and teach wellness to the recruits. And there are some things that come up that are difficult to talk about. And I have heard on several occasions now that growing up with a parent that was in law enforcement wasn't very easy, and that they can now see as an adult how it impacted their relationship and things like that. So, hopefully I'll be able to get that perspective and input as we kind of move our program forward. But
Mhm.
it'll be great to touch base with you to see bounce some ideas off you and kind of share some things that we're trying and let you know.
Yeah, I would love that. I think that would be awesome because I do think that children are often forgotten about. There's a lot of, this goes for anything really. There's a lot of focus on, building communication skills with your partner and, doing life with your partner and how can you open up to them and talk to them and all of these things in both directions. But a lot of times some of that fallout sort of affects the kids and it's just not really thought about. I mean, it's to no one's fault. It's just they're kind of almost like collateral damage in some ways. And so I think for me, a big thing with what I'm doing, and I'm glad that you brought that up, is bringing awareness to this because
Mhm.
again it's something that people don't think about, they don't really talk about it. It's just not on their radar that it needs to be addressed. Again, it's no one's fault, it's just sort of forgotten about. I think part of that is because people think like, oh, kids, they're not going to remember this anyway, or oh, kids, they're off doing their own thing, but they really do absorb and notice more than you might think, which I think is why the normalization aspect that I experienced was so big. And that goes for, just having so many cops in the family too. It was very normal to have conversations about who's going to miss Christmas, who's going to come late to Christmas, who's going to be in uniform on Christmas. Um, Even just like being around people who have, you know, guns on their hip. It was just like these are things that are not normal in children's lives, but for me it was just kind of part of the territory, and I think that that normalization is a lot of why I kind of turned out the way I did.
So what you're saying is you're normal.
I like to think so.
Well, Catherine, it's been so educational, informative, and it's been really kind of a pleasure just to talk to you. You seem like such a great person, and I'm excited to see how things go with what you're doing with the community that you're building because it's something that is really needed. And is the one thing I do want to ask is like, is there anything else that you want to share with us about things that you're doing in 2024, things that you're planning besides what you've already talked about? Because I want people to check you out, know where to find you, and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the podcast, there's the upcoming community, but in the meantime, on my website, beyondtheuniform.co, just co, I have an events wait list. So if you sign up for that, I'll be in touch about all of our upcoming events. I'm planning on quite a few in 2024. So I would love it if you're in the Philadelphia area, if you could attend some of the live ones. But also, I've got the online ones coming up too. So just get on the events list to find out more.
Great. And I did notice, and you made a little bit of mention of this, is that you said you're a fitness coach. And I did see that there's some fitness offerings that are on your site. Are those things that you teach for first responders and military?
So I'm a fitness coach, not specifically for first responders and military. I'm more of a generic online fitness coach. But if you're a first responder and you need a fitness coach, you know who to call.
Yes, you do. There you go. There's another idea for you right there.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I saw that there was some sort of a fitness class or something like that. So I didn't know if that was also like the type of events that you will sometimes offer.
Yeah. So there was one in September. We did a police family fitness event. It wasn't hugely popular, so which I'm kind of bummed about because I think that it's a really cool idea of, connecting with other cops and spouses over fitness, but also bringing your kids into that world. I mean, we all need it in our lives, and it's a fun way to connect with other people. So I really thought that it was going to have a great turnout, but it was less than ideal. So I might be trying more in the new year, but TBD. If you are listening and you do think that that is something that you would be interested in, let me know because I'm, any feedback anyone has, I'm open to it because I really, I want to make sure that I'm offering things that these men and women can really benefit from. So I'm very open to feedback from your audience.
Well, and I don't know what the dynamics of the offering was, but I would encourage you to maybe give that a try again because I think family fitness, I think that's a really great idea.
Okay. I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah. I think just because something doesn't work the first time doesn't mean you don't retry it again and maybe tweak some things. But I think that's a really great way for family, for anyone to connect really is through fitness.
Absolutely. 100%.
Well, Katherine, is there anything else that you want to share? Anything you want to tell the listeners that we haven't already covered?
No, I think that's it. I'm really excited about the podcast launch. It's going to be launching February 6th of 2024. So be on the lookout for that. Yeah, that's all I got.
Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful. It was so nice to talk to you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you enjoyed the show, we ask that you give us a like, a review, and share. And remember, we are better together.